Hey, Dana. Good Thursday morning to you all. President Trump is in Beijing, and so are we, as the president faces tough talks with China on trade and dealing with North Korea. Elections last night, of course, in the U.S., still reverberating even halfway around the world. This is Special Report. Good morning. I'm Bret Baier coming to you from Beijing. It's 7 o'clock Thursday morning. President Trump has a lot of work ahead here in China after doubling down on North Korea in a speech before South Korea's parliament last night. Kim Jong-un fired back, saying America faces a, quote, abyss of doom if we don't remove President Trump from power. Meanwhile, some American voters are speaking out in what Democrats are touting as a rebuke to the president, handing the Democrat Party wins in several states. But first, here in China, President Trump faces a delicate diplomatic dance with Chinese President Xi Jinping, trying to get China to help solve the nuclear standoff with North Korea, while also working on a better, fairer trade deal for the U.S. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts is traveling with the president. He's here in Beijing and joins me now with more. Good morning, John.
Bret, good morning to you. President Trump recently congratulated the Chinese President Xi Jinping with consolidating power in his ruling Communist Party, becoming, as the president said, the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao. President Trump today is hoping to enlist that power to end North Korea's nuclear program.
President Trump arrived in Beijing to the splendor of a state visit and an opera performance in the Forbidden City. But it is North Korea's nuclear program that will dominate talks today between the president and Chinese President Xi Jinping.
I also have come here to this peninsula to deliver a message directly to the leader of the North Korean dictatorship.
Before arriving in China, President Trump had tough words for Kim Jong-un in a speech to South Korea's National Assembly.
The weapons you are acquiring are not making you safer. They are putting your regime in grave danger. Do not underestimate us, and do not try us.
The president laid out a scathing indictment of the North Korean regime, branding Kim Jong-un as a criminal dictator. But at the same time he was playing the role of bad cop, President Trump was good cop too, offering Kim an exit ramp from the escalating crisis if he gives up his nuclear program.
Despite every crime you have committed against God and man, we will offer a path to a much better future.
The response from North Korea was predictable. The U.S. must oust the lunatic old man from power and withdraw the hostile policy towards North Korea, an official statement said, in order to get rid of the abyss of doom. President Clinton's Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, thought the speech was right on point.
I do think that the statements that he made in his official speech about seeing the advantage of talks, I think is very important, and at the same time pointing out that we have a very strong deterrence with 3 aircraft strike groups and a nuclear submarine out there.
President Trump had hoped to send a strong message to North Korea and its patron China by standing at the DMZ shoulder to shoulder with South Korea's President Moon Jae-in. But the secret early morning trip was scrapped when fog prevented Marine One from landing at the border. Still, the president hopes to have laid a robust foundation to enlist more help from China when his state visit turns from pomp and ceremony to the tough business of diplomacy today.
A strong show of support from Chinese President Xi Jinping could also bolster the president's position when he is expected to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin. That'll be at the end of the week, Bret, likely tomorrow or Saturday at the APEC conference in Da Nang, Vietnam. Bret?
John, a lot of focus on the elections last night in the U.S., but the president wanted to commemorate 1 year ago for his election, the big election, the general election.
Yeah, it doesn't often happen, Bret, that Election Day falls on the same day, but it did as they were losing the GOP races in Virginia and New Jersey. The president was celebrating that with his address to the National Assembly in South Korea, where he mentioned it, and then tweeting out this picture aboard Air Force One with the caption, quote, "Congratulations to all of the deplorables and the millions of people who gave us a massive 304 to 227 Electoral College landslide victory." Don't know whether or not the election results from Tuesday are sort of a one-off or two-off type of thing, Brett, or if they might actually be a harbinger of things to come. The president certainly hopes that they are not. Brett?
All right, John, thank you. As John mentioned, back in the U.S., Democrats are claiming to have the momentum today after wins up and down the ballot Tuesday night. From a big win for governor in Virginia to history being made at the local level in the Commonwealth. Correspondent Peter Ducey reports from Arlington on what it all means as the political dust settles.
Republicans were run out of Virginia last night, and Democrats say there's more where that came from.
Tonight is a wake-up call.
Not only did Governor-elect Ralph Northam earn the most votes for governor in Virginia history, but Democrats flipped at least 14 seats in the House of Delegates, sending the first openly transgender candidate, the first openly lesbian candidate, and the first Democratic Socialist candidate, among others, to Richmond.
You have sent a message across the globe to South Korea. Donald Trump, you don't stand for our values.
Good morning, everyone.
The Democrat who stands to become Speaker if the party wins back the House thinks last night will have Republicans heading for the exits to avoid a tough political atmosphere.
We get the fresh recruits and they get the retirements. We get the A-team.
But the governor-elect himself said this morning it's hard to tell if last night signals the start of a Democratic wave. And Northam is clear that he wasn't used by national Democratic leaders looking for a high-profile victory in the Trump era.
Yeah, I don't think that I had been, taken over by the national agenda. I certainly think there were a lot of comments being made, but this is about Virginia. For
all the talk about Trump in the wake of Northam's win, there was none in Ed Gillespie's concession speech.
I felt called to serve. I hope God will discern what his calling is for me next.
A person familiar with the president's political operation tells Fox the president gave Gillespie a big boost in the southwestern part of the Commonwealth. And the president thinks he knows why things didn't go Gillespie's way, tweeting, quote, Ed Gillespie worked hard but did not embrace me or what I stand for. Don't forget, Republicans won 4 out of 4 House seats, and with the economy doing record numbers, we will continue to win even bigger than before. The so-called Bannon wing of the GOP piled on, with Breitbart News calling Gillespie a swamp thing after he lost. And that kind of sentiment can be very damaging to gubernatorial candidates in Virginia, according to the last Republican to win, Bob McDonnell.
I think Virginians are very much independent. They very much look at Washington, and they typically don't like what they see in the nation's capital, and they vote the other way in Virginia. And I think this was a good example of that.
It sounds like senators on both sides of the aisle are getting ready to do something that Ed Gillespie never did, and that's invite President Trump to their battleground state, because a GOP aide tells me tonight the Senate map for the midterms is very pro-Trump. That's why so far even Democrats haven't been afraid to ride on Air Force One with him. Brett?
Peter Ducey live in Arlington, Virginia. Peter, thank you. There were some other notable firsts in last night's election. New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio easily won a second term, becoming the first Democrat to win re-election since Ed Koch 32 years ago. In New Jersey, Ravi Bala will become Hoboken's first Sikh mayor after being targeted actually by flyers that labeled him a terrorist. And Chris Hurst, a former Virginia news anchor whose girlfriend was shot and killed during a live broadcast in 2015, defeated a Republican incumbent for a seat of the House in the House of Delegates. Meantime, Maine's Republican governor believes voters made a mistake when they voted to expand access to Medicaid. Governor Paul LePage has vetoed 5 attempts by the state legislature to expand the program there. It's the first referendum expansion of Medicaid in the country. Carl Icahn, business mogul and former advisor to President Trump, has been subpoenaed by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. The Attorney's Office has opened an investigation into activities by Icahn and his businesses related to the country's biofuels program, while the billionaire investor was serving as an advisor to the president on regulatory reform. Critics said that was a conflict of interest. Icahn stepped down from that role in August. He and his company are cooperating with the investigation. A federal judge has imposed a gag order in the case against former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort and his business associate Rick Gates. In that order, the judge directs attorneys to refrain from commenting on the case in public so as not to prejudice the case. The special counsel office is charging both men with financial crimes. This is the co-founder of Fusion GPS. That company behind the unverified Trump dossier agrees to appear before the House Intelligence Committee next week. The deal comes a day after Fox News learned Glenn Simpson met with a Russian lawyer before and after a key meeting she had last year with Donald Trump Jr. at Trump Tower. The election losses for the GOP now ramp up the pressure on Republicans to try to get a big victory on Capitol Hill. Today, House GOP lawmakers spent a third day trying to come to a consensus on their tax plan. Chief Congressional Correspondent Mike Emanuel has a tax reform progress report.
If anything, this just puts more pressure on making sure we follow through.
Speaker Paul Ryan's takeaway from Democrat victories in governor's races in New Jersey and Virginia is Republican lawmakers must deliver on tax reform and their agenda.
One of the chief promises we made when we ran for office in 2016 was that we would do tax reform and tax cuts for families, for people. And so we have to get on with doing that.
Top Democrats were giddy, suggesting passing tax reform would cause some Republicans to lose their seats next year.
To our Republican friends on this tax bill, as Clint Eastwood said, you want to pass this tax bill? You want to hurt the suburbs? Make our day.
The House Democratic leader picked apart the GOP plan.
View what is happening in these rooms not as tax reform, not as tax cuts, but a tax scam.
This is day 3 of the Ways and Means Committee working on the GOP tax plan, what is known as a markup. Yet there are signs the bill could change substantially.
The clerk will call the roll.
The current estimate from congressional actuaries is that the plan would cost $1.7 trillion over the next decade, but the 2018 budget calls for $1.5 trillion. And that figure is critical in order to pass tax reform with a 51-vote majority in the Senate. GOP leaders are hoping to vote it out of committee tomorrow so it can be brought to the House floor next week.
If homeownership is the American dream, this GOP tax scam is the American nightmare.
I don't believe that government is the incentivizer here.
Once Ways and Means finishes up its preparation of the tax bill, the Senate is expected to release its own tax package as soon as tomorrow. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell invited Democrats to join the GOP on tax reform.
Senators, members of the administration, and tax reform advocates met here in the Capitol to discuss a mutual vision for relief.
There is some suggestion Democrats may be emboldened to stick together and oppose tax reform. Pelosi is already saying the door is open for Democrats to take back the House. Brett?
Mike Emanuel live on the Hill. Mike, thanks. The markets end the day in the green today. The Dow rose 6. The S&P 500 moved 4. The Nasdaq rose 21 points. Vice President Mike Pence makes a trip to Texas today to pay his respects to the families that lost loved ones Sunday. This as we hear horrific details from the survivors inside that church when the killer opened fire. Correspondent Matt Finn reports from Sutherland Springs.
Gruesome new details from the Texas church shooting reveal just how horrifying the Sunday massacre was. Roseanne Solis and her husband survived.
All of a sudden I hear like firecrackers popping. Ta 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 ta. Everybody started screaming, yelling. Everybody got down, crawling under, wherever they could hide. It was so scary, and that man was shooting. He was shooting hard.
Solis says the shooter spared no one in his sight and targeted anyone making noise, including babies.
Be quiet. Everybody was saying, be quiet. It's him, it's him.
First Baptist Church was recording its service. According to police who saw the tape, the shooter first killed the audio and sound people handling the recording. Then he systematically shot anyone in sight, including Joanne Ward, who was killed when she used her body to shield her 4 children. Only 2 survived. A friend describes the heroic mother.
She said, I would die for my children. And she ended up having to do that in the very end. And that does not surprise any of us in this community that knows her, because she loved them so. And she gave it up for them, ultimately.
Today, the list of names of the 26 victims was released, showing how some families lost multiple members. 6 people with the last name Holcomb were murdered, including a pregnant woman and a 1-year-old. Vice President Pence, his wife, and Attorney General Jeff Sessions met with victims' families in Texas today. Pence was also briefed on the investigation and is scheduled to speak at a vigil this evening.
I'm a believer, and I believe in prayer. And I know that at this moment of such heartbreak and loss in that community, that what most Americans are most able to do is to pray for those families.
The shooter's encrypted cell phone was sent to Quantico for the FBI to unlock it. Tonight, there is no update on the FBI's progress, but we will continue to follow that. Right now, 12 shooting victims, including 2 minors, remain in the hospital, and on Sunday, the First Baptist Church will hold services at a nearby community center. Brett.
Matt Finn live in Sutherland Springs. Matt, thank you. Up next, the Trump administration starts to undo a significant Obama-era policy. First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country, the U.S. that is, are covering tonight. Fox 21 in Colorado Springs, where a cadet who claimed in September to be a target of racism at the Air Force Academy prep school was actually the one writing the remarks on the dorm walls. The story drew national attention after a video of the head of the Air Force Academy giving a blistering dressing down of cadets and staff following that incident, and it went viral. Today, the school said in a statement that the cadet admitted to lying and is no longer at the school. Fox 13 in Tampa, where investigators are looking at the plane that killed former Major League pitcher Roy Halladay. The tiny sport plane he was flying Tuesday when it crashed into the Gulf of Mexico was an Icon A5, one of only about 20 in existence today. The former Blue Jays and Phillies pitcher was among the first to fly it. Halladay was 40 years old. And this is a live look at Chicago from our affiliate Fox 32. One of the big stories there tonight, former President Barack Obama does his civic duty. The former president waving as he headed in for jury duty today. For many inside, his appearance was no surprise, as they were given a heads up weeks ago that President Obama would serve in November, although a date was not given. That's tonight's live look outside the Beltway from Special Report. We are way outside the Beltway in Beijing. We'll be right back. .20 in the morning here in Beijing. The morning traffic starting here on the roads just outside. News of a significant role of the 2012 Benghazi attack has been indicted in Washington. The man Mustafa al-Imam is charged now with 1 count of conspiracy to provide support and resources to terrorists, resulting in the deaths of 4 Americans, including U.S. Ambassador Chris Stevens. The Trump administration is following through on a promise to start rolling back another Obama-era policy as the administration cracks down on Cuba following mysterious sonic attacks to U.S. diplomats there. Correspondent Rich Edson shows us what changes and when from the State Department.
For Americans, traveling to Cuba will look more like it did before the Obama presidency. The Trump administration will require most Americans visiting Cuba to do so through an approved tour company, just as they did before President Obama's 2015 overhaul of U.S.-Cuba policy. American companies and travelers are also banned from spending money with 180 Cuban businesses officials say are under the control of the Cuban military.
What the Trump administration was trying to do was tweak this policy so that the benefits of what travel there is to Cuba actually goes to the people of the country.
He's an excellent guide.
The administration says many Americans who already booked a flight or hotel can still travel. The same applies to business deals, like one equipment supplier Caterpillar already signed. Americans can still bring home rum and cigars for personal use. The U.S. and Cuba still maintain diplomatic relations, and officials deny these changes are related to the sonic attacks that have injured 24 American diplomats in Cuba. And another change affecting the region, the Trump administration is ending a special designation allowing more than 5,000 Nicaraguans to live in the U.S.
The name itself explains a lot of it. Temporary protected status. This was put in place 20-some years ago as a result of natural occurrences that took place, flooding, hurricanes, that type of thing.
Many of those migrants came to the U.S. after Hurricane Mitch destroyed their homes in 1998. They have until January 2019 to leave the country. Temporary protected status is designed to help those in countries suffering from natural disasters, war, and other crises come to the U.S., work, and then return home once it's safe. For those who must leave the U.S., it's unclear how many will do so voluntarily and how difficult it will be to deport them. The administration says it extended the program for 86,000 Hondurans through July and is reviewing whether to continue beyond then. Protections for Salvadorians and Haitians are also scheduled to expire in the coming months. It is unclear if the Trump administration will refuse to extend those as well, potentially affecting hundreds of thousands. Brett.
Rich Edson live at the State Department. Rich, thank you. 3 UCLA men's basketball players were arrested here in China just a day before President Trump arrived for his official visit here. The 3 freshmen were questioned about stealing from a Louis Vuitton store next to the hotel where the team is staying in Hangzhou. The university says they are cooperating with authorities. Meantime, in basketball, former NCAA coach Rick Pitino knew everything. That's the allegations coming out of an unsealed indictment in the college basketball's pay-for-play scandal. Documents show that the University of Louisville coach had knowledge of the scheme between his players and Adidas representatives and even directed payments to players. Pitino has denied the allegations. He and athletic director Tom Jurich have been fired from the University of Louisville's athletic department. 100 years after the Russian Revolution, how many deaths do historians attribute to communism? The answer, and a look at where communism remains strong today, straight ahead from communist China. First, other stories beyond our borders tonight. The Trump administration joined Saudi Arabia in accusing Iran of supplying Yemen's Houthi rebels with weapons, including a ballistic missile that struck the Saudi capital last week. A statement from the White House says the U.S. condemns the activities and urges the United Nations to review evidence that Iran is perpetuating the war in Yemen to further its regional ambitions. Britain's International Development Secretary resigned today after Prime Minister Theresa May put the brakes on a foreign trip by Priti Patel over demands Patel be fired. Patel had been under pressure to go since it was learned she had unauthorized meetings with Israeli politicians. Patel is the second cabinet departure in Great Britain in a week. And in Spain, pro-independence protesters stopped traffic Wednesday in Catalonia to protest the jailing of ousted Catalan government officials and secessionist activists. Big traffic jams reported on roads leading to Catalan cities, including Barcelona. Those are just some of the other stories beyond our borders tonight. We'll be right back to Beijing after this. In visiting the Korean Peninsula and here in China, President Trump is getting a close-up look at the region where the much discredited ideology of communism still maintains a strong presence. His visit occurs exactly 100 years after the communists seized power for the first time anywhere. Our resident historian, Chief Washington correspondent James Rosen, looks back on the Russian Revolution and its meaning today.
Workers in St. Petersburg scrubbed the statue of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known as Lenin.
Red birthday!
But a century after the Russian Revolution he led, the stain of communism on the modern world remains indelible. Far from creating a workers' paradise, the philosophy of Karl Marx, virtually everywhere it's been tried.
In Havana, dictator Fidel Castro leads the Cuban May Day celebration.
Has instead brought only totalitarianism and an estimated 100 million deaths.
Lenin was the template not just for Stalin, but for Mao and for Pol Pot.
Michael Oslin is the author of The End of the Asian Century.
It is the godlessness, it's the lack of faith in anything superior to the state, anything otherworldly, and also the fact that there is no room for individual private property or markets.
After they seized Petrograd in November 1917, Lenin's Bolsheviks executed Tsar Nicholas II and his family. An emigre from Moscow, Dmitry Simes, is president of the Center for the National Interest.
Because when the Bolsheviks took over, almost everybody assumed, except the Bolsheviks themselves, that people so cruel. people so inexperienced, people so fanatical. They cannot stay in power for a long time. Well, they stayed in power from 1917 till the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991.
A non-aggression pact between Stalin's Russia and Hitler's Germany lasted 3 years. By 1942, Russia, the United States, Britain, and France joined forces to defeat the Axis powers in World War II.
In Moscow, the 44th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution gets underway.
In the Cold War, the Soviet Union exported revolution. The rise of Mao Zedong in China gave the USSR its most important ally.
Mao treats his visitor to a glimpse of Red China's military might. A parade of Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks.
The decline in retrospect was slow but steady. President Nixon's visit to China exploited Sino-Soviet tensions and helped bring China into the modern world. 2 books by Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich and the Gulag Archipelago, laid bare the brutality of the Soviet state. And at the Berlin Wall, President Reagan summoned the spirit of human freedom.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Communism persists today chiefly in China, which embraced some forms of private enterprise starting in the late 1970s, and in North Korea, which is speeding towards a nuclear weapons capability, even as some 2 million people there have starved, and the economy depends almost entirely on assistance from China. Bret?
James Rosen in D.C. James, thanks. Let's discuss what the president is up against during his visit here to communist China. John Bolton, former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, joins me from Washington. Ambassador Bolton, thanks for being here. I want to get your reaction to James's piece and this mark about where we are on communism around the world.
Well, I think the Chinese model obviously continues. They once called it communism with Chinese characters. But right now, Xi Jinping, according to all reporting, has as much power in China as Mao Zedong did at the height of his rule in the 1950s. So as a justification for authoritarianism, not as an ideology bringing egalitarianism, but what it has always been once it's gotten power, an ideology of brutality, the Chinese are still doing pretty well. Remember Orwell's famous description of the Communist Party in power as a boot stomping on the face of humanity forever. That's how Xi Jinping maintains his power. It's not as visible as it is before because the instruments of terror are very well known.
You know, Ambassador, if you look at a map of the countries under communist rule right now, President Trump is going to visit 2 of them on this trip here. You've got, obviously, China here, Cuba, Laos, North Korea, and Vietnam. Here's the president in South Korea yesterday, our time.
America's men and women in uniform have given their lives in the fight against Nazism, imperialism, communism, and terrorism. America does not seek conflict or confrontation, but we will never run from it. History is filled with discarded regimes that have foolishly tested America's resolve.
What'd you make of that speech?
I thought it was an excellent speech, clear, strong, Reagan-esque in many respects, and I think it squared the circle that the president had to in South Korea, which is very divided on how to handle North Korea, by making it clear he would do what he needed to do to stop North Korea's nuclear weapons program, but hoping to keep South Korea very much on side and citing the cooperation of the 2 countries since the North Korean invasion in 1950. Obviously, his other audience was China, where you are now, and I think the meetings on Thursday in Beijing, certainly trade will be involved, but the meetings on North Korea will be the most important meetings of this entire Asia trip.
You know, I want to get your thoughts about how now, in retrospect, the media overall looks at communism. Recently, I saw a New York Times opinion piece, and it was about how did women fare in China's communist revolution. And it said, quote, "For all its flaws, the communist revolution taught Chinese women to dream big." And our friend Mark Thiessen wrote a response to that and said, good God, communist revolution killed 65 million in China. Is there kind of a recasting of communism as history goes by here?
Look, the New York Times has been wrong on communism for a full century. This is the newspaper that sent Walter Duranty to the Ukraine and got a Pulitzer Prize for reporting that somehow missed the famine caused by dekulakization in Ukraine, killing millions of people, starvation and execution. And when Stalin died, in the New York Times obituary, it said, well, he did have these show trials in the 1930s and purges and executions. And it then said, but those who survived his terrorism came to hail Stalin as a great leader. I mean, it's no wonder the New York Times doesn't get it today. Why should they change course?
Ambassador Bolton, as always, thanks for your comments.
Thank you, Brett.
Up next, the all-star panel with reaction to last night's Democratic victories in the U.S. and what it means for U.S. politics ahead as we continue from Beijing, China.
This is one of the first major elections since Donald Trump was elected. Tonight, New Jersey sent an unmistakable message to the entire nation. We are better than this.
In Virginia, it's going to take a doctor to heal our differences. And I'm here to let you know that the doctor is in.
Virginia's turning bluer all the time, and New Jersey is hardly a surprise.
You learn as much from losing, if not more, than you do from winning.
If they go into the next races and say, oh, he wasn't enough like Trump, we'll have even bigger victories.
We're half a world away, but the big election results last night, still big news in the U.S. We'll talk about the president's trip next panel, but you take a look at two big governor's races, the Commonwealth of Virginia, obviously. You have almost 9 points for the Democrat Ralph Northam, and then in New Jersey, really a blowout win for the Democrat Phil Murphy. President Trump tweeting out about the Virginia race, Ed Gillespie worked hard but did not embrace me or what I stand for. Don't forget, Republicans won 4 out of 4 House seats, and with the economy doing record numbers, we will continue to win even bigger than before. What about the fallout from all of this? Let's bring in our panel from D.C. Steve Hilton is a former advisor to British Prime Minister David Cameron and host of The Next Revolution here on Fox News Channel. A.B. Stoddard, associate editor at Real Clear Politics and host of No Labels Radio on Sirius XM. And Byron York, chief political correspondent of The Washington Examiner. Okay, Byron, the fallout from last night's big win for the Democrats.
Yeah, it's good for Democrats, bad for Republicans. And I think the president's point that Ed Gillespie somehow did not embrace Trump enough just doesn't really hold water in this case, because Donald Trump lost Virginia. And the idea that since Trump himself did not win, the idea that Ed Gillespie could just be Trumpier and somehow win by doing that, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And the other thing is, it really does. It's a bad portent, I guess, for next year, because remember, presidents usually lose a lot of House members and sometimes in the Senate in their first midterms. Reagan lost 26 House members, Clinton lost 52, Obama lost 63. So barring some big unforeseen event, which could always happen, Trump's probably going to lose a bunch of them too.
Yeah. What does this mean, A.B., for tax reform? Take a listen to Senator Cornyn and Senator Schumer on the future of tax reform.
A lot of what we're seeing in the stock market, seeing in terms of consumer confidence, sort of has baked in the cake the expectation that we're going to get tax reform done. So we're absolutely determined to do it, and failure is not an option.
If you do fail, is the majority at risk?
Failure is not an option.
You want to pass this tax bill? You want to hurt the suburbs? Make our day.
So does this give impetus to Republicans to say, we really need a W after these wins last night for Democrats?
Brett, I agree.
And Speaker Ryan said that today. Basically, it only, makes them more committed and more panicked, frankly. But I think if you're looking at the debate that they're having, trying to get to a bill on tax reform, and the nervousness of some Republicans that they might have some constituents next year who say, wait a minute, my taxes got raised and the doubling of the standard deduction didn't really make a difference and didn't help me out, and you've put me in a real jam. The problem is that passing and enacting tax reform at this point might not even save their majority. They can't go into the elections without passing it, but there's some nervousness now that this is going to be painted as the Democrats next year as a gift to donors and to corporate America, but not so much to the middle class. And if the polls, the polls show that this proposal, whatever it is, and of course it's fluid and changes every hour and is not remotely what will come out of the Senate ultimately and be conferenced by the two chambers, but the polling shows that what Americans think of it right now, it's unpopular. So this is a worry for Republicans, even if they pass it, that it might not be enough to save them.
Yeah, by the way, we're hearing from our own Chad Pergram up on Capitol Hill that the markup probably is going to come out tomorrow from House Ways and Means, and there could be a significant change to what they've already been talking about coming out. So we will watch that very closely. Steve, what about this? Extrapolating out from an off-year election, some people say this means momentum for Democrats. This is really a harbinger of bad things to come for the Trump administration and Republicans. Others say, hey, listen, Virginia's gone the other way for every president. In an off year.
Well, Brett, as always, everyone wants to read into the results what they want to see. But if you're objective about it for a second, I think that there's a danger of overstating the degree to which this was only about Donald Trump, and therefore the lessons are all about the degree to which candidates and parties either oppose or embrace Donald Trump. I think one interesting thing, particularly about the Virginia elections, not just the governor race, but the state legislative elections, is that there was a huge amount of outside money, outside groups, and a lot of Silicon Valley involvement in terms of testing out new ways of recruiting candidates, turning out the vote, organizing campaigns, and it worked pretty well. And I think that should really ring alarm bells, not necessarily for the White House, but for the RNC, in terms of being outpaced organizationally, because all of that success that was proven in Virginia, that's going to be rolled out across the country in 2018, and particularly for the state legislature elections in 2020, which whoever controls those shapes the districts for the subsequent decade. And so there's really high stakes in getting high turnout for state legislative races, and the Democrats showed they know how to do that last night.
Yeah, if anything else, it was a psychological momentum boost after a long string of losses for Democrats. Byron, I want to turn back to tax reform quickly. Senator Kennedy weighing in on how this is different from health care for the GOP.
At this point in the health care debate, at least on my side of the aisle, it was just a free-for-all. I mean, people were standing up and giving ultimatums and saying, if you don't include this in the bill, I won't vote for it, or you added this to the bill and now I'm unhappy and I'm not going to vote for it. We've had none of that in terms of tax reform.
Yeah, with that said, most of what you hear from Capitol Hill is we have to get this done.
Well, it better be different from Obamacare for Republicans. There's no doubt about it. The one thing that I think gives you some confidence that Republicans are going to get this done is that tax reform and cutting taxes is in their wheelhouse. They didn't know how to pass health care reform. That hasn't been their issue for a couple of generations as it has been for Democrats. Tax cutting, yes, they know how to do this. So I think that puts them on much surer ground than with health care, and I think that's what Senator Kennedy was referring to.
All right, panel, thank you. Stand by. Next up, the North Korea threat and the delicate balance the president has to strike here with China's president.